think we're going to go ahead and get started. It's a couple of days after, but I know there are a few others who are going to come, and I'm sure they'll be here. Marty Broadwell is with us this morning, as we have planned and as we've announced now for several weeks and even months. And Marty's been with us before, I think maybe at least 2 other times. Is that about right? And we've only been doing this for about 5 years. And Barry Kirchhoff's been with us a couple of years, and I think Marty's been with us the last 3, if I'm not mistaken, or some derivative, the last 3 out of 4 or whatever. But I've known Marty a long time. Marty lives in the Atlanta area and works with the Embry Hills Church and has been with them for a long time and served in various capacities with them. But he also has done a lot of secular work, and I'm not here to tell you everything he's done. It'd be hard for me to do anyway. We're not here for that purpose. But I've always appreciated and admired Marty for multiple reasons. And I've told you that many times. He's one of the best Bible teachers I've ever heard. And when he's come here and when he's taught us, the reaction of you has been such that I felt it important to ask him to come back, and he's agreed to that. And he's always gracious to do it, and I appreciate it. He's got some grandkids in Huntsville, so he can come this way a little easier when he goes see his grandkids. So we're glad he could do that. But Marty's just such an exceptional person. I knew him, and I knew his wife Mary for a long time. She passed away 9 years ago, and that's hard, I'm sure. But they have both just done such good work, and I'm glad Marty can be with us today. To talk about what the law means, I've looked forward to this, and since you sent me the outline, I've even more looked forward to it, because I think it'll be a great study for us. So before I turn over to him, let's begin with prayer, please. Father, how grateful we are for the opportunities of the morning. We're thankful that Marty was willing to come and be with us. We're thankful for his study and for his knowledge, for his ability to come and for his safe travel. Continue the blessings as he returns to his home later today. Be with all of us, Father, this morning as we listen and as we study through your word. May we learn about law. May we learn to glean the things that are very important to each of us. And we're thankful again for the time that we have to be together. Again, continue to bless us, we pray. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Well, first, thanks for coming. Thanks for the invitation. And my prayer is it will be useful use of time this morning. I have this feeling every single time, though, when I present something, especially to faithful men who are interested enough to come out on a Saturday morning and listen. And that is, I think, just the evaluation, study, brain cells applied to some spiritual problem is worth the time, whether I have great things to say or not, new ideas and so on. I hope you'll help me develop this material even further with good ideas. Now, all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him that thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. That verse is from 1 Corinthians 10, and if you know the verses that precede that, there's a recounting of the failure, really, of the Israelites in the wilderness. Remember that? They had all these blessings, God's protection, his provision for them, and yet they murmured and they committed immorality and they rejected their leaders, and God allowed as he says, their bodies to fall in the wilderness as a testimony, really, to their failure to remain faithful. And then Paul says, what does he say? These things happen to them as examples. They're written for us to learn from, and that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do this morning. You might be turning over to Deuteronomy 6. That's primarily where the text will come from this morning. And this is the title of the session. I'll say more about what the title actually means. What is the meaning of the title might be a topic for later, but we'll look at that. Here's my outline. I want to understand where Deuteronomy chapter 6 fits in the story that Moses told about the history of Israel. I want to look at the particular question that's in chapter 6, verse 20. I want to see how Moses recommends that the fathers, and that's why I think this is a men's study appropriate topic, what were the fathers supposed to say to their sons when they asked this question? and then maybe conclude by looking at our ability to answer that question in a couple of dimensions. Knowing the right answers is one, but also in our personal preparation. Okay, so we'll talk about that. I don't think I have to put this point up here, but I just want to keep explaining the relevance to you. Who is God's select people, chosen nation today? Who is that nation of priests and so on? It's us. It's us who have accessed God's grace through Jesus Christ and now are part of a holy nation. We actually are priests in the same sense that the priests were priests in those days. We look upward to God and represent Him to the world that's watching us, right? We also, through our personal relationship, through the veil, offer up sacrifices directly to God as those priests in those days did. And really looking at some language from Deuteronomy in this little section of chapter 5 through chapter 7, so you are God's holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for Himself, a special treasure. ESV says a treasured possession above all the peoples on the face of the earth. And you know where that language is used in the New Testament. 1 Peter 2 says, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. So I don't think I need to convince you of that point, but I want to remind us of that as we go into it, that we are, in a sense, the reality for which the nation of Israel was the shadow. Is that a fair way to say that? Do you agree with that? They were imperfect. In a sense, they were a failure, but they brought the Messiah into the world for God's real plan to make a real kingdom that lasts forever in eternity, and a real priesthood and a real royal nation and all the things for which we are the reality. But we ought to be able to learn from those shadows about the mistakes and the victories, really, that they observed. Okay, that was an introductory speech to kind of say, hang in there, because it's got a bunch of Old Testament stuff, but may be relevant for us today. So I want to ask this question. Who wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy? Who wrote that? Yeah, Moses did. That's right. And whom did he write it for? No, that's too tricky of a question. Y'all are still cautious that I'm going to ask trick questions. So I'll go back. Who was it addressed to at the time? Yeah, that's to whom, or that's who it was written. Now, the story, if you think about it, does it just cover the history of Israel? No, it doesn't. Where does it start? That's right. But Moses wasn't alive in the beginning. So Adam didn't write the first part, and then, at some point Abraham took over writing it, and Joseph took over writing. No, the book of Genesis was written by Moses for the children of Israel. Why did they need the story about the beginning of time? That's not their history. No kidding. I'm going to repeat some of the comments just for the sake of the microphone. They had, I wonder what kind of people they were when they got to Sinai, which is just, 40 days after they'd just escaped from Egypt. What did they know about what a man and a woman are? And how did we get here? If they knew something, it's probably wrong, right? Because it came from the Egyptian. If you look at the Egyptian fables about the creation, they're amazing. They're almost, gross in a way, there were, one story was there were two different, I think maybe brother and sister gods or something, and one of them sneezed and the other one spit, and that's where the air and the water came from, just in case you wondered how, the water and air firmament thing. Well, that was one story. There are lots of others that are even grosser than that, that I wouldn't even repeat. But that's the Egyptian mythology about the creation. And if you thought that the world was kind of brought into some organization by a bunch of human-like gods, what would you think about humans themselves and their value and their worth? You wouldn't think very much. You might even say, kill all the babies of a group of people that you didn't like very much. Right? So the Israelites come out, and I have an idea that their concept of God, well, even their concept of what a human is, was all corrupted, or maybe just they were completely ignorant. And so, interestingly, think about Genesis being written to the Israelites at Sinai. I don't know exactly when all these things got written down. They were trying to understand who they were as people, as men and women, as creations of an eternal God, right? And you can imagine all the confusion or just ignorance that they had about that, and their relationship with God. Well, that's kind of the first 11 chapters of Genesis right there. All right, and then something happens. In fact, maybe we should just stop and review what's happening in those 11 chapters. First, there's a creation. Everything's great. God's blessed them all, and then what happens? Sin. Man messes it up, you might say. And are there consequences on the world that come from that? Yes, terrible consequences. Between man and God, between the man and his wife. Now their relationship is corrupted. Between man and nature, he has to work, by the sweat of his face. And not to mention death coming into the world and a lot of terrible things. Well, so man's messed that up, right? And then man starts to multiply. Right? And so you have Cain and Abel. How did that work out? Not a great story. How about the descendants of Cain? We're moving on into chapter 4. How did that work out? You kind of see a decline. You see Lamech marries multiple women. He takes revenge tenfold. His role model even seems to be Cain. He said, if Cain was avenged, some amount, then I'm going to be 7 times more manly, or whatever he thought he was saying. That wasn't good. How about the sons of men that came through the lineage of Seth? How did that work out? What happens by the time we get to chapter 6 in Genesis? To the sons of men and the sons of God. What happens there? Onward and upward, right? Social evolution, right? Progress toward perfection. Is that what happened? No, it's this way, right? And so we had the flood. God said, that's it. I'm starting over. So he starts over with Noah. How did that work out? Down to chapter 11, you end up with the Tower of Babel, and the man's pride has to be taken care of. Do you see a pattern here? Now, does that pattern continue in the rest of the Bible or not? No, everybody's learned their lesson. I keep thinking we're going to learn our lesson, right? What happens in the rest of the Old Testament story, really, in the nation of Israel? Well, we just read from 1 Corinthians 10 where, they didn't even make it out of Egypt 40 years. Why was it 40 years after all, right? And so they didn't make it there. And then, of course, the cycle, you see it in the Judges, don't you? A cycle of decline. And then in the nation as a whole through the kings until finally God resets everything with the captivity. You keep seeing resets. God, and by the way, he doesn't do it. It seemed like to me there's not a gradual increase. Like we just get the right political party in power. You know what I mean? We get some conservatives in the kingdom, and then somehow slowly, with lots of laws, more laws passed. They love those laws, right? They obeyed them very well. And they just start, I don't know why we have this confidence. Sorry, this is a side commentary. We have some confidence today. If we just could get the right people in power and pass all the right laws, it would somehow save our society. Is that the way God ended up fixing things all through history? No, what did he actually almost always do? Floods, Babylonians, Assyrians, right? And so that's kind of, are y'all ready for that? But some confidence in human ingenuity and human politics, and I think that's silly. That's not God's plan. However, what do you expect of our society, especially having rejected God? What will be the pattern, you think? It will be down. And we shouldn't be surprised at that. That's the way things work. So the repeated story, I've mentioned some of those things. I should mention Romans 1. That's often mentioned. You can see almost in that cycle there that men forget God and they're not thankful, and they don't acknowledge his eternal divinity, power and divinity, and so they decline. And it says over and over, God gave them up. Have you seen that in Romans 1? And there's a threefold step down. Well, what's going on? I believe God made the world so that when you forget him and you give way to your own lusts or even unnatural passions, he just keeps giving you up to the next step down till you end up with a depraved mind and people being mean to each other, to say the least, which is the latter part of that. So have I convinced you that that's kind of where we are? And if you look, then at the end of chapter 11 of Genesis, back to that again, it's almost as if God does a different kind of a reset. And who is introduced in chapter 12, which really begins in a way, the whole Bible story of redemption, right? Who's introduced there? It's Abraham, right, exactly. Abram, I guess he was called at first. But he says, I'm making some promises to you. And it's actually not just your name will be great, but you'll have a great nation. And you'll have a land one day. Yes, that's kind of the shadow in a way. But what was the third thing? All the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed. And so now the story begins, almost as if this is going to be a more eternal reset of everything. And that's what happens then beginning in Genesis 12. And the rest of the book really is about, again, now I'm back to the Israelites who don't know who they are or anything. And it's kind of explained to you, you don't know who you are, but listen, I'm going to tell you about a man named Abraham, or Abram, and the promises God made about a land and a nation and all that. And by the way, in that land, there's great and special places. Do you know what happened at Bethel to the patriarch Jacob? Remember that story? No, you don't know it, but I'm going to tell you, Moses is saying, right? All these wonderful things about Beersheba and, I don't know, Shiloh, I guess, or Oaks of Mamre, or places where great events happen. A Cave of Machpelah comes to mind. So they've never been there, these Israelites, in Moses' day, but their descendants have been there, and it's a special place that they're returning to. And Abraham, it seems, Genesis 18:19, if you just look at that passage, it's in the incident where God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember that? And he said, shall I withhold from Abraham what I'm about to do? And then God goes on to say it. It's almost like Moses is telling the narrative of what Yahweh was thinking. And he says, because I have chosen him. Why? Because he will keep his children and their children faithful. You see, that was very important to somehow make it from Abraham all the way to the Exodus with a nation that stayed faithful to God. Is that a challenge? To try to make the next generation faithful, given that the law of gravity, it works this way. And I'll ask this question. I want you to talk among yourselves just for a minute or two. Why is it that each generation is inclined to question the previous generation's values? Do you agree that that's true? Have you observed that? Some of you are old folks. Some of you were probably hippies. No? Oh man, that didn't go over well. Bruce, were you a hippie? Yeah. And if you weren't a hippie, you saw the hippies because they were your friends, right? And some of you might be a little older. You were looking at us, thinking, what? What are they doing? And what were they doing as hippies? Rebelling against whom? Yeah, what did you say? The establishment. Thank you. That's the exact phrase. Yeah. Y'all don't know, you young folks don't know what we're talking about, but that was kind of the description of in a way, all that was wrong with society, Yep. Oh, sorry. So why is that? I want you to, and why is it there always, I'm kind of being absolute here, a desire to depart from traditions? Is that often the case with the next generation? I can remember we went from wide lapels to narrow, and then bell bottoms to tight, and then, there's always, you got to do something different. And then to disregard part of that picture, the beliefs of the past, and search for something new. Is that happening right now in our little society in America? Is it happening in other countries, like Iran and other places? Yeah, it is. Can I make a bizarre illustration? Maybe you can go with me on this. You know that in Iran, I think that girl was not wearing her head covering. You remember that story? She came into town, and the modesty police, or whatever they call themselves, they arrested her, and they took her into custody, and apparently maybe were hitting her on the head enough that she ended up dying. Y'all remember that story? And that sparked a whole bunch of protests nationwide, some of which has been suppressed. Maybe I shouldn't go on with this illustration. I'm not sure it's going to work. Y'all hang in there, or just shut your ears if it's not making any sense. That total Islamic system is wrong, it's false, it's evil. A lot of things are bad about it. But suppose you really believed it deeply. Can you imagine the challenge those old guys have in trying to keep the country, those young people, who are just flooded with the internet and awareness about the rest of the world? Can you see the problem that these old guys are going to have in keeping those traditions going in Iran? Do you understand that? And you're probably saying, what's his point? My point is, that's a hard job. And I have a little sympathy, right? Not for what they believe or nor the way they're going about it or anything. I'm just thinking, if they feel an obligation to try to keep the next generation somewhat faithful to those traditions, they got a really tough job to do that. And you can see that what they're trying to do by violence is not working. That's not going to work. I don't really know. Sorry. If that didn't make any sense to you, just erase that last little illustration. But I think we do have somewhat of an analogous problem. So talk amongst yourselves. I want you to tell me, why does each generation tend to question, right, or want to do something different? Well, talk about that, and then let's have some answers. All right?
For a better one.
Yeah, don't talk to me. Talk to each other. I want you to try out your answers on one another. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. Yeah.
It's not change for the sake of change. It's change for the sake of that. Not just somebody does. The world tradition, right? That's why we all question. Is this one? Then you come just where you don't believe it's just what's let's keep it the status quo because that's what we need to change it. We need to change it because we understand that's what we're doing.
All right. I hear really good discussions. What I can hear, but so share with me what's wrong with these young folks. Why do they always do? So sorry, yeah. And me when I was that age, right? I mean, so yeah, you have to be careful to be too, critical of the young folk because
That's the part of it, the maturation, you sort of step away from your spouse and make your own mind. I'm thinking if you get in your 20s and you're making your own career,
Sure.
making your family.
That's a real good.
Talking about how you sort of return back to that as you get into the structure of being a father, a big, husband, and you get conservative again, I guess.
That does seem to happen, doesn't it? And it may be that after a while you keep learning the things that, or relearning is probably the right word, that your parents before have learned, and there's some sense of, I see what they're, oh yeah, I never thought that happened to me, but it did, But his point before that, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, isn't youth a kind of a natural time of exploration anyway? So there's probably a natural phenomena that kind of says, I want to be on my own, I want to make my own. And maybe you chafe a little bit against the parental advice, which also often comes in the form of a tradition or the old way of doing things, and you think, well, I don't know why we have to. So you want to explore. And yeah, I think God made us that way, right? I think and I believe, this is more theory that I can't probably prove necessarily, I think there's within each of us this kind of nascent tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I'm sorry to say it that way. There isn't a literal tree out in the yard or somewhere in the world where we can all go still and eat, decide whether or not to eat of the fruit. Y'all know what I'm saying there? But as we grow, those, in a way, inclinations of childhood to rebel, to be independent, those form temptations in our own conscience, and we get to choose whether we want to do right or not. So in the early form, that's great. So natural exploration of youth. Is that a fair rubric for that? Yeah. Yeah, more.
As far as going away from things, I think a lot of that is our fault, where we don't allow...
Oh, wait a minute. Wait, we don't blame each other in this. No, I'm sorry, go ahead. I agree with you, actually.
We don't allow questions, or when there are questions, we don't want to answer them, we shy away from them. And I think to...
And what does that do to a young person who's in these questioning years, and I ask a question, and I get the kind of like, well, because it is.
Find answers.
Yeah, I mean, it's disappointing, right? I thought there was something suspicious about this whole system. And now when I try to ask a hard question, what do I get? Pushback, opacity, something like that. Yeah.
But I also think they don't see the importance to us. And so I guess a classic example is with the children of Israel, why did they fail? Well, they're going by Gilgal and they see this pile of stones. And the kid says, oh, what is that? Oh, that's where we set up some stones, when we cross the river. As opposed to, wait, you don't know? Okay,
Yeah.
Sit down.
Yeah.
Imagine this whole valley was flooded with water.
Yeah. I'm going to have to stop you because you're teaching my whole lesson right now. That's good, what he's saying. So I'm kind of looking, I do agree, yes, where he's going is where I'd like to go too. But I think there's some validity. I'm naturally exploring. I do ask hard questions, and I get kind of nondescript, non-convincing answers, right? I think that's a really important point. And so what else? Other thoughts? Keep going. This is exactly...
Individuality.
All right, say more.
Individuals.
Oh, sure.
Carve their own path.
That's right.
And asking these questions, they're looking for their own decisions. They want to make it.
That's right. And there is, and I'll add to that, there is, and especially in our culture, a huge value for being your own person, right? I mean, our culture, now I'm speaking for our culture, not the Bible view of things, would it be acceptable to say there's really one right way that everyone should try to follow? Is that acceptable? That there's something wrong and something right, especially in the realm of metaphysical or religious things? Is that even, I mean, you could almost get prosecuted for that kind of language, In fact, there's some sense in some, I've read that there's a sense that, religious indoctrination, which we might actually all of us be engaged in, is a child abuse. That's kind of a charge at the moment, because what are you going to do? You're going to instill guilt and all that. Each person has to find their own way. That's the American system for sure. And that's the sense of our philosophy of the day, right? So I think maybe we push them into that, maybe in some ways, rejecting the previous to say, well, you told me to find my own way. I'm just trying to do that. Good. Other thoughts?
I think with traditions, somewhere down the line, if it's not taught why we're doing it, then you lose the purpose of the tradition.
Okay, right. Doesn't carry the meaning with it. This is great. You're also getting way ahead here. Yeah, right, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
It's also important to know the difference when you say the word tradition.
Yeah, right. What do we mean?
Sometimes it's good to depart from a tradition. I mean, look at Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees. I mean, their tradition had become law. And so it's sometimes good that there is this kind of malleability to the law, if that's even a word, of making sure that we know, okay, that was something man set out, that's not doctrine.
Sure.
And, there's a difference in that between the world and especially in the
Yeah.
church.
Let's go on down that path a little bit more. Suppose I am I'm an inquisitive, I don't know what age you want to put, 18, 20, so I'm just in my inquisitive period of time, right? Semi-rebellious and all that. And I ask the question, and the answer is, well, that's just the way we've always done it. And so really, whether it's a tradition of men, as you say, with no real meaning or depth or authority behind it, yeah, I'm interested in that. I want to know. And how is often religious practice presented in our culture today? From God or man-made? It's man-made. Well, of course you should question it. It's man-made. That's kind of your point, right? And that is our worldview, that we've evolved, a little bit more than other animals, to the point that we think about kind of spiritual type things, but we just invented all this religious stuff, right? Bible and Christianity and traditions and practice and all that. But yeah, everybody needs to find their own way. Let me seed another point that I want to make sure we get to, and that is, I'm in the 70s or late 60s, and I looked at the previous generation, the establishment. Thank you for that terminology there. Did I see something that was highly respectable, or did I see some things that were pretty terrible? Yeah.
Segregation.
Right. I mean, that was one of the big items, the war in Vietnam, corporate America and all of its ills, the Watergate, the corruption of politicians and all that. And so I'm a young kid, and I'm thinking, I'm not following those guys. You see what I mean? I mean, of all the things, and so the idea of just dropping out and turning on with drugs or whatever, that you can see why that would make a little sense, and that is, I don't have any respect for what they've done and where they've taken us, where we've gotten to. Now, maybe wrong choices were made, but you can see that the previous generation's behavior and the results of that behavior is sometimes a little bit of an incentive to say, no, whatever we're doing, we're not doing that anymore, because that was kind of a disaster. You all talk about that kind of a thing? When you look, and I think sometimes it's maybe misjudged or maybe more harshly judged than it should have been, but that was the logic behind it. Though you old folks can nod your heads and say, yeah, I remember that. There was a lot of things going on that maybe made the next generation say, well, whatever we're doing, we're not doing that. So there's this temptation. All right, you get the point. Bottom line point is a challenge. To try to say to the next generation, hey, there's something valuable here that we need to look at. So here's back to Deuteronomy again. The book of Deuteronomy is kind of divided into, well, different ways of dividing. But 3 speeches is one way to look at it. I don't know if any of y'all deal with contracts, I guess even for houses, but legal contracts for companies. There's always the preamble, and it has the word whereas. I don't know, maybe isn't that in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or something, right? But the whole point is, I'm about to tell you some history that leads up to why we have this document. Whereas we are here, and you are you, and I'm me, and we're doing this and all that. And so there's a little bit of that in Deuteronomy. If you read 1 through 5, that speech is Moses kind of setting what was going on. And in the beginning of the book, it tells us where they are and what they're doing. And that is, they're in the plains of Moab. And honestly, I don't know why it says this side of the Jordan. I meant to look that up and understand it. But it's clear where it is, because he says it's in the land of Moab. And which side is that on? Moab. It's on the eastern side. They're going to cross over into the land. Did I do the backward gesture correctly? I hope so. This is east, this is west. Yeah. So they're in the plains of Moab, and they've just defeated Sihon and Og, and they're really on the doorstep of the promised land. And Moses is just about done as leader. How old is he at this point? 120, I think somebody said. And really, he only has, I think, days to live. If you read through the book, it's like at some point right near the end, after these speeches. And you see here, it's in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month. And God's telling him, you're not going into the land, and they are. And he says, in just a little bit, you're going to go up and climb up Mount Pisgah, and that'll be it for you. So Moses is right at the end of his life. And but anyway, they're spread out there in the plains of Moab. So shortly, under the reign of Joshua, the manna will stop. They will be recircumcised, repurified to God. They'll keep the Passover, some other things, almost like there's almost this image of their bar mitzvah, if I can use it that way, right? And by the way, who are all these people that are gathered there in the plains of Moab? How old are they? It's the second generation. Well, what happened to the first generation? They're all dead, right? So I could imagine somebody that was like not quite 20, 40 years earlier might still be there. So they might be not quite 60. But for the most part, it was all people who had kind of been kids or grown up in the wilderness up to 40 years old. So again, there's a reset that's happened in a way. God has said, okay, you want to take the promised land, you're just going to die here. We'll look at the irony of that in just a minute. But that's where they are. Everybody got that picture? 40 years in, Moses is speaking to them. The middle part of the book, then beginning in chapter 5, is he reiterates the 10 commandments, the 10 words that were stated in Exodus at Mount Sinai, right? And here, 40 years later, we're going to go over this again. And then after that, after the part we'll look at in chapter 6 and 7, there's a detailed description. Actually, it seems to me some new ordinances that may have grown out of a need because of their misbehavior in the wilderness, in my theory. The things about marriage and divorce and that kind of thing that come up later in the book. But anyway, that's the context. And then the last part of the book, the third speech, is the latter chapters in which Moses is basically saying, and by the way, our contracts are this way too. What's the preamble? What are the terms of the contract? What is you say you're going to do, I'm going to do, right? And then, if you don't do it, here are the remedies, or here are the consequences, right? That's the structure we understand. And so Moses said, if you keep these, then you'll be blessed. If you don't, bad news. You'll be driven off the land. You'll be taken into captivity by a nation, that language you don't even understand. So, preamble, the details of the terms and conditions, and then the consequences. That's kind of a picture of Deuteronomy. So, we're through the preamble. We're just beginning the terms and conditions part, where the law is restated, and then some words about keeping the law. Let me ask you this. If you look through things that are listed, say, in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy following. In fact, you can flip over to, 12, 13, 14. How would you characterize this law? Is it detailed? Tedious, that's a good word. There are a lot of details. Is it difficult? Do you think it might be difficult to do some of those things? Now, I understand there's some that just like fear the Lord your God with all your heart, soul. Okay, that's kind of a little abstract, but what does that really mean? Well, if you look down the details, cloth, their cloth couldn't have mixed material in it, threads, yeah, right, and then a lamb without blemish, or a goat or something, and then you do this, and then you do that, and the priest does this, and what about the things the priest wore in the tabernacle and all the terms there? And what about the laws of even morality and purity, and what you could eat, and who was clean and could come before the assembly? And y'all know what I'm talking about? You see what I'm talking about here? This is a pretty detailed law. Was it going to be expensive to keep that? I mean, have some financial consequences. Okay, he's vigorously nodding, which means I'm going to ask you to say why you say that.
Just a lot of animal sacrifice.
Okay, yeah, I mean, start with that. Every family, and the firstborn and the best, perfect animal, start with the sacrifice.
I've heard, we all think of tithing, but and I don't know where they got the data, but somebody one time told me it was about 30% of their income.
Yeah,
tied up.
Sure. So, right. Great expense, even to the point that there were special provisions made for people that couldn't quite afford to do that, if you remember. Yeah, that's right. And was it gory?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of difficult. And was it severe if you broke some of those laws? I'm not saying what they did later. I'm saying, what does the law say, right? In fact, it's interesting. I was trying to figure out, did anybody really ever get stoned in the Old Testament for breaking the law?
There was, yeah.
For what?
Working on the Sabbath.
Yeah, what was he actually doing? You remember? He's collecting sticks for a fire. And so it's interesting that, but then after that, it doesn't seem like anybody was ever stoned for violating the Sabbath. Now, you can probably think about, what is his name, Achan in the Battle of Jericho. That was kind of an instant place where he just disobeyed. And by the way, I think that Achan incident inaugurated Joshua's reign, right? Say, we're serious here. You know how when you set a law, and then there's always somebody that wants to test the law early on, and then if they get it, then maybe everybody else learns. So I think Achan was the beginning of Joshua's reign. I think the man with the sticks was maybe the beginning of Moses' reign, because it happened right away. After the giving of the law, there's a guy collecting sticks, and they say, what do we really, no, you're really not going to, no, we are going to do that. And so they stoned the guy. But after that, I think it was one other fellow that I think listed in, I believe it's Deuteronomy, maybe Leviticus, who did something kind of, I think, sacrilegious.
They were fighting, and he cursed God.
That's exactly right. It was sacrilegious. Thank you.
And then they
right.
had them all put their hands on him.
Yeah, like we're all doing this.
And then they stoned
Great, thank you. Other than that, did David get stoned for adultery? I mean, was there ever an instant where somebody was stoned for... Anyway, that's a side point. My point is, though, if they had done it the way God said, would have been pretty severe and difficult and bloody and meticulous. What was the word somebody used? Tedious. Might have been tedious. And with regard to the economic effects, have you ever thought about what happens if you don't plow, harvest anything for a whole year? And in the year of Jubilee, maybe actually 3 years of impact to the crops, right? Because it was a Sabbath year, the 50th year, and then you hadn't planted anything. What happens then the next year? Did they ever do that? Sorry, this is just a side point, but did they ever do that? No.
They did during 7 years of captivity.
That's right. It's not recorded. In fact, what is recorded is that God said, because you haven't kept the land's rest, I'm going to give it rest by putting you off of it. Remember that? That was the prophecy of the captivity. Okay, too much of that, but you get the idea. Do any of the requirements in the law seem weird to you? Like the tassels of your garments and trimming your beard and, you know what I mean? And maybe the cloth thing and all the costumes and, yeah.
I always wondered about how do you get leprosy in your house?
I know, yes, right.
Leprosy in your pots.
Yeah. It meant something to them, I think, but we don't know for sure. Yeah, I would just say there's some of them that we would have to say, I don't think we know why those laws were there. We can kind of zoom out and say, well, God's teaching about purity or God's teaching about, careful obedience or something, but I think there's some of those. Okay. I've mentioned the 3 speeches already. The second giving of the 10 Commandments in chapter 5. And then embedded in the book, actually in this early part, chapter 6 and 13, and certainly in the latter part, 31, 32, 33, in the Song of Moses, there's this huge warning of what? Moses keeps saying this over and over. You'll forget you. You're not going to do this. I'm just telling you that. In fact, when you all speak up and say, we will obey, you can imagine the crowd, we will obey. And Moses says, well, that's the witness against you, really, the fact that you've agreed to this. But what he says in chapter 8, in 6:10 through 12, which we'll look at, also chapter 8, and you can see it fulfilled in Amos. When everything's going great, you're in the land, you didn't build the houses, you got plenty to eat, what are you going to do? You're going to forget the Lord, right? And from one generation to the next, he mentions that in chapter 13, 6 and 7. And what happened when that generation that remembered Joshua died off and there was an apostasy? And Deuteronomy 4 and the same thing happened there. So Moses kind of prophesied, you're not going to follow this. All right. I don't think I will read this. I think you know that. I might look at this Song of Moses, which is near the end. Now, this is in the section that has to do with the consequences, terms and conditions, and then finally what will happen. Jeshurun, which is a nickname for Israel, I think, grew fat. That is, he had everything he wanted. He got spoiled. He was obese. He forsook God. Spoken in the past tense, but it's a song about what would happen to them. They provoked him to jealousy with foreign gods, provoked him to anger. I'm reading the yellow text here. They sacrificed to demons, to new gods, something new. We want something new, I think, that your fathers didn't fear. The rock, you were unmindful. You've forgotten the God who fathered you. And when the Lord saw it, he spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faith. Okay. Do you remember, this is just an ironic point. When the 12 spies went in, but they came back and the 10 spies said, we can't do it, too hard. They're giants. We're going to get killed. In fact, what they actually said was this, or the people cried, complained against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, if only we had died in this wilderness, why has the Lord brought us out to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims, right? Later in that chapter, God answers them and says this, your little ones, that you think were going to be victims, you said would be victims, I'm going to bring them in. They'll know the land that you have despised. And now that comes back actually in the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses says this, moreover, your little ones and your children, who you say will be victims, this is Moses retelling the story, who today, this is important, have no knowledge of good and evil. They shall go in there. To them I will give it, and they shall possess it. Moses' picture of this new generation, seems to me, is, no, they didn't get killed like you think they were going to. You're the ones who will be killed, and you have been in the wilderness now. And these, you might think of as innocent, blank pieces of paper, open-minded, maybe young folks who don't know good and evil. They're going to go in the land, and this lesson really is for about protecting them. Y'all see that? It's kind of interesting irony. And that is that maybe the hope really lay, whichever, in the new generation and not the old. That's an interesting view of things, but I think that's right. All right. Here's what I want to say. What was God's system for making sure that the young folk were faithful to Him primarily, but also to the law that He had given them, that they agreed to? It's always confused me a little bit is that when Moses and even the Lord in prophecy speaks to Israel, it's almost like it's the same people at Sinai that are way over here in, 800 years later in the Babylonian captivity. They're not the same people. Y'all are aware of that. They didn't live that long back then, And still there's a sense of continuity between that generation and the next and the next and the next. Somehow or another they're seen as a whole picture. What was God's system to try to make the next generation faithful? What was His system?
Passing down the knowledge.
From whom to whom? It was really kind of the home. We're going to see that. I think you believe that already, but it's interesting to me what it isn't. Did He establish a network of Israeli universities all over? There were the cities of refuge, but that wasn't their purpose. Where all the kids had to go, for 5 years and go to this university and be indoctrinated into the national system of religion. Is that what He did? No. Did He have special priests that were trained in young people ministries, right? To try to keep them faithful, right? We're going to have special assemblies and camps and retreats and basketball leagues or whatever we need to do, right, to get them together. And these special priests who were trained to be youth ministers, I'm sorry, I'm mixing old and new terminology, but you see where I'm going with this, right? Was that His plan? It wasn't that. We're going to create neighborhood schools. We're going to create moms, communities or something. No, in fact, if you zero in, who is it actually? You might say parents to children, but can we be more specific even than that? Fathers. I'm sorry to say that was His plan. And we're going to see that in the plan here. But I think one lesson, maybe an application for us, is we're kind of hoping the church will do it, or that some camp that we send our kids to, or some college will help them remain faithful and answer these hard questions that they're going to ask. I'm sorry, that's not God's primary plan, and it never has been. It isn't in the New Testament either. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. That's the plan. Now, you know what I'm going to say, and I almost don't even want to say it, Now, I'm not saying, okay, you know what I'm not saying. But what I am saying is that the primary responsibility is given to the fathers. And you can see in the text, I'm looking now in chapters 5 through 7, look at all the references to fathers and mothers. In the first place, in the Ten Commandments themselves, the first commandment with promise, I think is what it's called, is what? Children, listen to your mom and dad, right? Honor your father and mother. So start with that, all right? And then he starts talking about the fact that this relationship with Yahweh dates back all the way to Abraham. Remember that story? Reset. Who, we learn from Joshua later, whose father worshipped idols. That's interesting that Joshua makes the point, are you going to go back to the gods that your fathers worshipped in Ur of the Chaldees? And so Abraham made a big change, I think, more than we maybe realize when he listened to God's call to come out. He turned from idolatry, the idolatry of his family. I believe that's a clear Bible teaching or implied Bible teaching, right? Okay, And then the patriarchs. It was a family thing. The fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And looking forward in the Ten Commandments, again, I think the first commandment or the second, depending on how you count them actually, I guess. God says, I'm a jealous God, and I visit the iniquity of the fathers to where? The third and fourth generation. So the negative consequence of not teaching lasts for generations. And I have an idea it's not just as simple as God gets so angry he can't stop punishing the next generation. It's because those generations are probably worse and worse as a result of the lack of teaching on the part of the fathers. They deserve that, and God set it up so that he does that punishment. Okay. Going on back. That it might be well with them and their children, chapter 5:29. You, your sons, and your grandsons, chapter 6, verse 2, which is where we're going to look. Teach them diligently to your children, 6:7. Can I hit this back here? Yeah, 6:20, when your son asks, that's our key text. And then, of course, the idea of keeping them from intermarriage with the people in the land. Is that because the Israelites were racist and they didn't allow any other nations to be interested in Yahweh? Is that the reason they couldn't intermarry? I said racist because that has such a negative connotation today, right? Is it because the other nations were seen as, genetically inferior in some way? No, what was the reason? It's very clear whenever it said. They'll turn your hearts away from me. Exactly right. Which almost implies if you had someone from another nation who turned your heart to Jehovah, like Ruth comes to mind, Rahab comes to mind, would they be excluded from from fellowship with Israel? Not at all. In fact, they're in the Messianic line, as you know. So just to say, the marrying thing is a huge danger that he warns them about in chapter 7. And covenants of any kind, of course, as well. Okay. I'm going to read down to in the text, and then we'll take a break. Okay? I'm just now getting to the question, and we can spend some time with that. So look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. I've got the context there. I want to get down to the question that's in verse 20. I won't read the whole thing, but starting with 6:1. Now this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you are crossing over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and commandments which I command you, you and your sons and your grandsons, all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. Therefore, hear, O Israel, and be careful to observe it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord God of your fathers has promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Hebrew word for hear is probably richer than hear. It probably means hear and let it sink in and obey. It's a shema is the word. And you might recognize this verse as kind of famous in the Jewish ritual as something that the Jewish men should recite every single day. This very verse right here. It's called the Shema, named after the first word in the verse itself. And so you'll often find Hebrew men, even today, will repeat this at important events, maybe every morning and that kind of thing. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And that's familiar to us too. Where does that reappear in the Bible? Say again. Yeah, greatest, thank you. And Jesus actually mentions this as the greatest commandment, or in the second likened to it, which is not here, it's later. But interesting, not in the Ten Commandments, but it's in this section, which this is an important section of text. And these words, which and by the way, words, I'm not going to go into. These words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them. Remember these words. We'll see them again in other references. As a sign on your hand, they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And I'm going to skip down now to verse 17. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, the testimonies and his statutes which he has commanded you. And you shall do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may be well with you, that you may go in and possess the good land of which the Lord swore to your fathers. Again, generational connection, backward and forward. To cast out all your enemies from before you, as the Lord has spoken. 20. Verse 20. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is the meaning of testimonies, statutes, judgments, which the Lord our God has commanded you? And I'm going to stop reading right there because that's the question I want us to think about. Have we covered already this morning that young people are likely to ask questions like that? Yeah, right. And have we also covered that who is the responsible person to answer it correctly? Right. And I'll just ask you right here, is Moses condemning this question? Don't ask questions, just do it. Oh no. He says when. Right? And almost as if there's a way you can encourage, hey, ask the question, And not in some ritualistic way, but I think he's encouraging this question. And I'm going to look at this chapter from the point of view of how it was answered. I just want to cover a little bit of Hebrew grammar first before our break. I think it'd be good to do this right here. When your son asks you in time to come saying what? And now, how many have a text that have italics representing that there's an interpolated English words here? Anybody have that in their version of it? What are you reading?
What is the meaning?
Yeah, what's in italics there?
Meaning?
Just the word meaning? Anybody else? What do you got?
I have what, do, and do is italicized,
Yeah, and then what?
and then mean.
Mean is italicized? Okay. Yes?
It says, what is the meaning of the testimonies? Is the meaning of.
Okay, is the meaning of. Did you hear that? Is the meaning of. That's 4 words there. And they're all not in the text. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute because I think it will help us broaden the significance and the meaning of this question. I'm trying not to use the word meaning, but I can't. The significance of the question, right? The breadth of what is actually being asked. And so here's an interlinear. I don't know if you use this very much. It's Hebrew, so you have to read from right to left. That's why I animated that way. I thought that was a clever way to point that out. But anyway, here is the actual, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Well, I get to see it left to right to left again. Here is the actual word right there. You see it? Can you read it? Is it big enough? Yeah. And the word is ma. Let's all say it together. Ma. It's almost just a sound. It's hardly even a word. I mean, it's got 3 letters in English, even fewer in the Hebrew, and it's really just almost like a sound. And here's the way it's actually used. If you look, somehow what is the meaning of is the translation of a Hebrew word that's just ma. That's all. How does that work? Well, here's how that works. Here's what's the point of that. The word what there is from this Hebrew word ma, and just so you'll know, there's the Hebrew symbol. It means nothing to me. I think there's some pronunciation marks on there. It may be meh, I'm not sure, but let's just go with ma for this morning, okay? And it's really, it's called a pronoun interrogative, which is kind of weird to call it that. I'm not sure it's really it's a question mark. It's all it really is. It's really just a question mark. You all know in Spanish, I think they put question marks upside down at the beginning of a sentence. And it's just kind of indicating, hey, what's going to follow here is a question. We put our question marks at the end in English, right? The other thing is we like subjects and verb structure in English. We like to have complete sentences. And so the translators put in these extra words so it makes sense in English. Y'all know what I'm talking about. But this word, ma, it actually occurs almost 1,000 times, maybe 1,000, in the Old Testament. And who is surprised at that? Question mark. Right? I thought that joke would work, but it apparently didn't. Why so many times? Because there are a lot of questions in the Old Testament, and that's the indication that a question is being asked. And so what you do in the Hebrew is sometimes they'll attach a little suffix or something, like lama or something, but then the word that follows is a noun or a verb, and it's just saying, think of this word as a question, not as a statement. Y'all understand what I mean? So in this particular text, he says, what? Statutes? Or ma? Statutes. And what he means is that noun, statutes, is a question. I'm just saying, question, statutes. But it's a very rich word, and you can look at the way it's used in there. So, for example, you remember after the creation, God brought all the animals before Adam to see, call. And how do we translate that? What he would call them, right, is a question. You see how that works? So keep going. They ate of the fruit. God shows up, and he asks Eve, done. What is he asking, really? What have you done? And I don't think he was just asking the question like, what just happened here? I think he was saying, what, why, how do you, because her answer was fuller than that, right? The serpent knew, told me and all that. You see what I mean? And then to Cain, after the jealousy over the sacrifices, he says, angry. See, that's kind of an adjective, I think. What's he saying? Why? That's not what have you done, it's why. Why? What's the cause? What's the meaning behind this temper, this anger that you have? And then, of course, he kills his brother and he says the same thing. Done. He's saying, what have you done? Let's keep going. Pharaoh. Remember, Abraham went down to Egypt and he had Sarah, who he's afraid would be attractive to the Pharaoh. And so he told a lie, half-truth, that she was his sister. Remember that story? And Pharaoh discovered, I think, maybe some revelation from God on that occasion or something. And he says, this? Like, what were you thinking, knucklehead? What do you, and he goes on to say, why, done this? Did you say? So he's asking why, what's behind this, what were you thinking? You see, it's a bigger question than just what is the meaning of law. So when the Son asks you in time to come, what law, he's not saying, remind me again, is it the firstborn or the secondborn? He's not asking details about particular laws. He's asking a why, a what, and that kind of thing. Do you see that, the richness of this word here? And so, for example, here's ones you'll remember. I wanted to cover these too. When the Israelites came out of their tents, and they'd been kind of hungry, and there's white stuff all over the ground. They go, it. And what were they saying? What is this? And you probably know that's where the word manna comes from. It's from that word. And so it kind of, you know what manna means, really. It's kind of, we say in English, it means what is it? And Moses, he answers their question. He doesn't just say, well, it's this chemical. No, this is food from Jehovah. He gives them a full, meaningful answer to that. Joshua 4, somebody brought up the stones, right? Same construction exactly. It shall come to pass when your son asks, what? Stone. It's all, stones. He's not asking, well, yes, it's actually granite. Is what it is. You know what I mean? No, he's saying, what's the whole meaning? What's the story behind this? I think, and that's because that's the answer they're supposed to give when they ask that question. You see that? And then the blood on the doorpost. Well, you can imagine them smearing blood on the door. And Moses says, you're going to keep doing this to remember something very important. And it comes to pass when your son asks the question, act, service, whatever noun goes in there, right? He's asking you the meaning, the breadth of this. Where did it come from? What's the origin? How do we do it correctly? And all that. So that's it. We've gotten to the question. I hope you understand the question that's being asked here. And that is, I think the question is, why? Why these? Why so many? Why so, what was the word y'all kept using? I cannot get it in my head. Why so tedious? Yes, tedious, costly, gory, difficult, numerous. Do they all matter? Is it really important? Do you have to do everything? You know what? I surely wouldn't have done it that way, right? That's not what I would have chosen. Explain to me why did God choose this? And really, I know a lot of educated, sincere Canaanite people who don't do this. And is that going to be an influence on the Israelites coming forward? So I think that's the significance of the question. Thank you for being patient. Let's take a break. What do you think about 10?
10 minutes at the moment.
Okay, all right. Oh, yeah.
going to that.
I'm calling to order. I wish I could say that this would indicate we're halfway through. I don't know that it does. So what statutes, testimonies, interesting, there's more words that describe, I think maybe 6 or 7 different words. Judgments, verdicts, or some translations. A lot of different words, kind of like Psalm 119, isn't that where all the different words for the law are used in this text? But what are the answers? But now don't look. Don't look at your Bible. Don't close it, but just, what are some answers that you could think of? The son says, huh? Laws? With all the significance that we showed before, right? What? We have all that? All what? Yeah. Right? I mean, I think that's in the context. In fact, in the context, he's already said, maybe twice before this point in the chapter, you shall be careful to observe it. Did you catch that? Hey, these are not the 10 suggestions, or all these laws that come along after this. There's a lot of meticulous, but guess what? This isn't just an example of what you could do. This is careful to observe it. What's your initial reaction? And you don't have to give me the best answer. Just what pops into your head? How would you answer something? You ever have kids that... my grandkids, there's actually 2 phases of the why, but there's an early phase where the response to any statement is why. You know what I'm talking about? But what happens when you answer that? Then what do they say? Why again? You're right. And I think it's just a matter of maybe continuing the conversation, the interaction. And so there's a curiosity just about what will this adult say. There's a later form of where you say it, usually in a command, no, you need to, clean up your room, and after that we're going to go to church. And they say, why do we have to do that? That's a little different question, isn't it? It's suggesting I'm looking for a way out, or I'm looking for a justification that I can pick holes in, or something like that. So I don't know. But that's the way kids are. There's the why. Okay, what initial reaction? What would you say? Why do we have to do this?
Explain the consequences.
What's that?
Explain the consequences.
Okay, because if you don't, something's going to happen. Now, that'd be the case in the family, perhaps. You might start with that.
But even in Moses.
And does Moses talk about consequences if you don't obey? Oh, it's full of that. In fact, the back half of the book, that third of the book is just all great. Good answer. And you should be afraid, actually, of that happening to you, right? What else? That's good. What else comes to mind?
The positive aspect, deliverance.
Okay. You'll get a reward if you do it, right? I mean, there's the opposite of that.
I would tell him, I understand what you're going through. I went through it myself, but I'm not going to stop teaching.
Okay, so now you've turned the attention a little bit away from the law to me personally. That's good. We'll talk about that as well. Are we tempted to sometimes give an answer like this? Well, God just said it. The Bible says that. It's in the law. It's what you have to do. In fact, we sometimes think, why do we sing or something like that? And our answer is, well, Ephesians 5:16 and, Colossians 3:17. We find those verses and say, well, that's why. God said, it's in the Bible. It's right there. Right? I mean, is that...
Part of the answer is, you have to be there with me.
Okay.
And so, let's talk about that. When we're walking, when we're rising, when we're sitting.
Right. That's
You gotta
right.
be there.
All right. If I keep waiting too long for you guys to answer questions, then you teach the lesson before I get to it. So that was, but y'all see where he's going with the whole thought of this. So I want to look at what Moses actually says. So let's look at the answers that he recommends. Here's the question, verse 24. The question, verse 20. The answer that I want to look at first, notice I didn't say it was the first answer, but the one I want to look at first is in verse 24. And the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God. Well, now that's the answer that you came up with first, because if you don't, you're going to be punished. Was there reason for them to fear Jehovah at this point in their history? And I mean fear in a good and a bad way, both ways. Give me some reasons. Why should they fear the Lord?
What he's done.
Like what?
Well, he destroyed the Egyptians.
That's right. We came out of Egypt. He's going to talk about that.
He destroyed everybody but that.
They just finished, by the way, killing off Sihon and Og. You remember that? And Moses led the battle there. Sorry.
Example, go back, he says this is what he did without the only people he saved.
Okay, so Moses is, as we talked about this morning, he's already told this whole story about this reset and start over thing as a result of evil, right? Yes.
They just watched their ancestors die off. For
That's
40
right.
years. They're all dropping in the wilderness.
Guys, you should fear the Lord. What's happened to your folks? Yeah, good. Yeah. And what about Sinai? Well, how was that as far as a peaceful, safe experience?
They wanted Moses to go up alone because they didn't want to listen about
It frightened them to death. He actually spoke at first, right? And then they said, whoa, stop, please, don't, not anymore. Just talk to this guy. And if I remember right, they kind of built some fences or barriers around the mountain because they didn't want anybody, animal or man, to get too close and be killed. It was a frightening experience. Now, here we're 40 years later. Did they really remember that? I don't know, but they'd heard about it. And the same thing with the deliverance from Egypt. I think of things like the 10 plagues, the Red Sea incident. Remember that? The pillar and the cloud. The pillar and fire. Pillar of fire and cloud, whatever, you know what I mean, fire and cloud. And all those things were kind of in fairly recent history, at least in the memory of their parents, and hopefully it had been in their memory. So I think the fear of the Lord is a fine answer. It's one of the answers that Moses says to give them, right? Nothing wrong with that. Notice it's in verse 24, not in verse 21, which is right after the question. But he goes on in that very verse to add another reason, which you've already mentioned too. There's kind of a positive side to this. Verse 24, reading on, fear the Lord our God, what? For our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is this day. There's a sense of survival and benefit that comes from this. And here's these two coupled ideas. Is God frightening, fearful, powerful? Therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade men, Paul said. He just finished saying, we must all stand before the judgment seat of God to receive the deeds done in the body. Remember that? Yeah, I'm afraid of that. And when I'm doing wrong, I get more afraid of it, right? I should. But turns out God is frightening, but he's also good. And he has our interest in mind. So in the first case, his power suggests he knows way more than I do. And then couple that with the idea that he really is doing this for my good. Does that mean I always know how it's for my benefit? So I'm beginning to address the question. I don't understand it. Well, yeah, because, to kind of vernacular, God might be saying, I'm God and you're not. So there are things I know that you don't, but I'm good. And I'm doing this for your benefit, always. And that's a fair answer, isn't it? It's a good answer. And you can even imagine hear parents saying that. Why do I have to do this? Well, 'cause I'm the mommy, that's why. Or you'll get a spanking if you don't. Or you don't understand this, but really this is going to help you grow and develop, and it's going to, you'll eat your vitamins and you'll be healthy, and whatever the reasons are that they don't understand. Don't understand at all, but I convinced them that my goodness would be part of that. All right, now let's go back and look a little bit earlier. Go back to verse 21, and what is the actual first answer Moses gives? It's not, I'm God and you're not, and I'm smarter than you and I'm trying to help you, not hurt yourself here. Look at what he says in verse 20. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, what's the meaning of the testimonies, statutes, judgments, which the Lord our God has commanded you, then you shall say to your son, what? We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. It seemed to me the first place Moses goes in this question about why do we have to do all this, or what's the meaning, are all these necessary, and I don't understand why God makes us do all this stuff. He didn't start by saying, I'm God, you're not. I'm smarter than you. It's for your good. You don't understand that, but it's really for your good. What does he start with? What is this? What's the point of that? That's right. And it's actually not, in a way, relevant directly to the law. Is there something about coming out of Egypt that relates to all these ordinances and everything directly. Now, I know there's a Passover feast and other things that do directly symbolize or help memorialize those. Y'all see what I'm saying? But really, does that explain why you can't mix thread and cloth? Not really. It doesn't. But it's the beginning of a context for where we are in our relationship. Whoever said that, it kind of describes already what God is doing for us. And I'm calling that the national story because it seems to me he's saying this about the whole nation. We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. He showed signs and wonders before our eyes, and so on. Notice the first person of that. Brought us out of Egypt, showed us signs and wonders. And it's not just a backward-looking, from your point, the backward-looking, here's what he did, here's the power he showed, but also what does it do? So, and guess what? We're going somewhere too. This story is not all in the past. It's actually a story of the future and our destiny in some sense in the promised land. So I think that's part of the answer too. Let's look at Exodus 13 for a very similar illustration of this thing. This is the case where the father Moses is saying in the future, you're going to have to dedicate the firstborn to the Lord. And in a way, you're supposed to dedicate your firstborn son because you were preserved in Egypt in the night of the Passover of the death angel. And but you can redeem that firstborn son. And I'm imagining in this whole sacrifice process, the oldest son is thinking, this is in years to come, what's going on here? And so all the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. So it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, and guess what? This same construction. You shall say to him, now, it's interesting, God just said we have to do this. It's in, actually, if you look over in Exodus chapter 13, they don't have rest, but I mean, he wouldn't point to the text, say, just show him the text in the Bible where we're supposed to do this. He doesn't do that. He says, by the strength of the hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, again, first person, out of the house of bondage. It came to pass when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and so on. Therefore I sacrificed to the Lord all the males that opened the womb, but I, the firstborn of my sons, I redeem. Notice this phrase, remember it for later. It shall be as a sign on your hand and as frontlets between your eyes, for by the strength of the hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So another situation where there's this strange ritual of sacrificing an animal, but the story, the national story, has to do with deliverance from bondage. Okay, so there's that. And he mentions the deliverance from slavery. And what I'm going to try to do in the next couple of bullets is show that there were various ordinances that he gave them, but in each case he linked it back to God's care, power demonstrated in the past. For example, in 7:8, he says, you should remember God will be faithful and he loves you. And how do you know that? Because he delivered you from slavery. Chapter 4, he said, when you go out under the stars at night, and you look up at those stars and you think, man, those must be gods. And I want to worship those gods, right? Here's why you don't do that. Commandment number 1. No, he doesn't say that. No, you remember that you were slaves in Egypt and God delivered you out. You see the point there? He doesn't say the first commandment says you shall have no other gods before me. He says, here's the story of God's power in Egypt. And that's why we don't worship stars. For example. In 5:15, interesting, this is remember chapter 5 is the reiteration of the law, the 10 Commandments. In the Exodus account, what was the reason for keeping the Sabbath holy? Do you remember? He goes on to explain why. There's a story behind the Sabbath day in the Exodus giving of the law. Pardon? Thank you, yeah. Creation, God rested on the 7th day, so this is the purpose for this law. That's not the story in Deuteronomy 5. He has a different reason, and it is you were delivered from slavery in Egypt. And so you're going to remember that rest from that terrible labor you were under in Egypt by remembering the Sabbath to keep it holy. You see the difference there? And he's making a story that really illustrates, really almost symbolizes God's past. I'm calling it the national story. Y'all okay with that? I mean, let's remember who we are, how we got here, what did God do to get us started, and then now what has He promised us in the future. This whole picture, not just history, but the story, past and future. And then powers and signs and wonders that He mentions in verse 22. We just read that. He delivered from Egypt. He had powers and signs and wonders. In other places, for example, chapter 4:34, He says, which of the idols do these kind of things? And that's the reason you don't worship idols. Only Jehovah, nobody else. And it's also the reason you should not have fear of other nations. Did the fear of other nations cause the Israelites to trip up later in their history? Go to Egypt, right? In fact, what was it? Was it Ahaz, I think, who actually went to Assyria to help him get delivered from Syria. If you remember, he thought Syria was the big threat. And of all things, he made an alliance with the Assyrians instead of counting on Jehovah to take care of him, And that was a problem. And they were told not to accumulate horses or go back to Egypt for help or any of those things in the law. But the reason was because God had already demonstrated His signs and wonders in the Exodus story. Do y'all see what I'm getting at here? So leap forward and imagine the question we're trying to prepare ourselves to answer. When your son asks you, what's the meaning of this commandment? Why do we practice this in our church, in our morality, right? In our generosity in the world? What's the reason? Book, chapter, and verse. Is there a place for that? Of course. But it seems to me that we ought to be thinking about what is our national story? What is the story that this command is a part of? That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay. And then, of course, the promise of care and blessings is listed in verse 21, 22. So 21, 22, 23. The past deliverance, the power demonstrated, and the promise that we're on our way that was promised by the fathers. Okay, I believe there's another answer. And it's found in the rest of the chapter. And I'm going to call this the personal story, if you don't mind with that. And for example, law and story. Let's go back to Exodus 13. We read about the redeeming of the firstborn. That's in the latter part. But go back to the first part of Exodus chapter 13. And it's a very similar incident. You're doing some strange thing. It has to do with unleavened bread. What? We have to eat unleavened bread? Do you know how hard that is to chew? And what's the point of that? In fact, you remember there was kind of rituals about making sure there wasn't any leaven anywhere in the house. And it was kind of important and all that. So it says, and skipping down to past the instructions about you keep doing this unleavened bread thing every year. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, this is done is interpolated. And it doesn't say that the son asked the Ma question. It doesn't say that, but I know he did because, right? The word because is used. So the father is clearly answering a question there. You see that? So it doesn't say when your son asks, but when he does, you tell him because, here's my answer, of what the Lord did for me when I came up out of Egypt. Do you see a little difference there? He talked about us before. And what's interesting about that is, keep on reading, it shall be as a sign to you on your hand, a memorial between your eyes. Remember that phrase. I told you to remember it before. Remember it again. It's going to come up in Deuteronomy 6. But keep reading. That the Lord's law may be in your mouth, for with the strong hand the Lord has brought who? You. That's interesting. You see what's happened? What was a collective story, He brought us out of Egypt, now becomes a personal story. And I wonder if the son actually was alive when they were brought out of Egypt. I don't think so. And in the future, none of them are alive. All those people are gone. And even in the time of Deuteronomy, most of them are gone. You see what I'm saying? But he's saying, I'm personally involved in this story. That's why I'm here today. And guess what? That's why you're here today. And so I'm pulling you into this personal story about what God has done. I hope you're making an analogy to today. What do we tell our children when they ask, why do we have to do all this stuff? I hope it has a personal aspect to it as well. We'll get to that. So what you see then, and look, now go back to Deuteronomy 6, and let's just look at some of the things that we see reflect the fact that I have a personal story that's part of my answer. And I know this is before the question, but so think of it this way. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to walk too far down here. But the answer is, it seems to me, In the first part of the book, he's saying, have you prepared yourself to be asked this question and to answer it with the way you've organized your life and your family? Don't you see that? And it's almost like do all these things as a preparation. Say it a different way. This is what qualifies you to answer with credibility. Do you know what I'm saying here? Now, if there were a lot of young folk, in our church, they mostly sit over on this side, so you can kind of walk over and say, now you young people, you know. But anyway, if there's anybody here that wants to, you young people, listen, just because a person seems hypocritical and their life is inconsistent and their answers are not all that great, doesn't mean they're not telling you the truth. I just want to tell you that. That's a little caveat. But boy, isn't it a lot easier when they're really convicted themselves and their personal story matches their national story and the other answers they give. Y'all see what I'm saying there? I think Moses is saying the only way this father, son, grandson thing is going to work, which he mentions here in these verses, is if there's a real personal commitment shown in these ways. And you all were kind of getting to that answer at the very beginning of the class, because you know that's where but that's what Deuteronomy 6 is saying. Build your life, your family, even your community around these. Then when the question's asked, you got some credibility to do it, to answer the question. So let's see some of the things that he says. This is the commandment, the statutes. We read all this before. Look down to verse 2. That you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, that you, your sons and grandsons, all the days of your life. So first thing is a family commitment. And I think that would be explicit. In our family, this is what we believe. This is what we do. And anything that's not this is not acceptable. And it might affect our relationship as a family. Be careful to observe it. There's careful compliance. I'm actually always interested to know, am I getting it right or not? What are the details? This is not, here's the place I will stick in this caveat. I know that there's a kind of a false teaching, maybe a false hermeneutic that just says, well, the Bible's just a story. That's all it is. It's just a narrative, which is kind of true. I mean, after all, these 10 Commandments, they're in a story about Moses and the Israelites, right? I mean, kind of true. But the thought sometimes, erroneous thought is, I just read the story and understand God's nature and understand man's nature. And I learn from it just by absorbing the example and character of the men. But the laws and checklists, that's not what God wanted to do. Is that true? Is that what this is saying? No, actually, I'm careful to observe it. Sure enough, it's a story, and the story is the context for the giving of these details, but I'm careful about it. And maybe my kids should see me sweating over the details. And how does this verse fit with that verse? And how does it apply in this situation? And are those easy questions? No, usually not. But I have to learn. I have to learn and show that example of careful compliance. There's an exclusive faith. The Shema, the Lord is one, I think ought to be understood in the context of idolatry. I think is maybe the best way to see it. And what is the point? The Lord is that a statement about the Trinity or what? No, I don't think so. It's a statement about there's not any other. All the idols are false. They're wrong. They're silly. They're powerless. There's an exclusivity in that. And do you think that exclusivity would look weird in the land of Canaan among the Canaanites? Or today in this world? Oh, it's weird as anything. It's as strange as anything can be, but we're comfortable with that as a family. This is the right way. The other ways are not right by definition of what truth actually is. You see, and I'm comfortable with that uniqueness, and it's seen in my life and my state professions of faith. Not only that, the law of Jehovah is in my heart. It's driven by love. Interesting tidbit of trivia here is, this is the first time love is used to describe man's relationship to Jehovah in the Pentateuch. So in the whole Bible, this is the first time that's used. Later in this chapter, I think on into chapter 7, I don't remember exactly, it talks about his love for you, again using the same word. But that's the first time. But it's a motivation that's not, yes, it's built on fear to some extent, but it's built on my relationship with Yahweh. It shall be in your heart. I think the sense of that is, it's internalized truth, and it's our identity and worldview. Now, you remember I told you we're going to see this phrase again. You see that? When you lie down, it shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. We've seen that twice already before in one of these things. What does that mean? Wake up. So what does that mean? Does that mean we should take little scrolls of Scripture and strap them on our heads so that they sit right here between our eyes? I've seen Jewish people doing that at the Wailing Wall. Or they take a strap and put it around their arm, and there's a box, and in that box are Scriptures. They bind it on their arm. Is that what that means? What is it saying?
Keep it always in front of you, on your mind.
I think that's exactly right. You wear glasses. You look through them to see the world more clearly, I think, is maybe an illustration of that. If something's right in front of my face and I see the world and I perceive the world, interpret the world, what am I actually? I'm looking through God's revelation at that. Other people don't have that advantage. I keep thinking of, what is it called? Augmented reality. Y'all high-tech people are aware of that. You know, you look at something, and this would be great. You wear these glasses, and the facial recognition puts his name right on his forehead as I'm looking at him. You know what I mean? Then I don't have to remember any names. I wonder if when we look through this thing that's frontless, we see the world in a totally different way. Things have different significance, and my kids see that. That's the way I live. And what about on the doorposts of your house and on your gates? Well, I skipped over something. One is there's an intentional transmission of these to our kids. They know that we have a schedule. And in our family, this has priority over other things, other kinds of learning, because every dinner time, right before bed, mom does this when they first wake up in the morning, whatever. There's a schedule, an intentional transfer. Not just get them down to the church house, but something that's a regularly scheduled event. And that trains them that this is important to me. And your belief is important to me too. And what is doorposts of your house and on your gates? Does that mean we have a plaque on the refrigerator that says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me? Is that the idea of on the gates, posting Scripture on our house?
That could be part of it, but.
Could be, yeah.
But people need to see you and your family, and you let your light shine.
I think that's exactly right. So what are my gates and my entrance to my house? That people are coming toward my house. What is it they're going to see? It's very public, very overt. Actually, they're going to see this law shining out of my house, my household in that same way. So I call that a public profession of that. All right. Now, okay, so I will come back and review all those answers, but we can kind of do it now. In this order, he says, first tell the national story. Remember, I reversed the order there. Then he says, tell your personal story. And that personal story is what the first few verses of the chapter are all about. Then he says, fear of the Lord. And then he says, for your good always. Now, I'm not saying that order's, canonical. You can't go out of order. But I'm just saying those are the ways they're listed as an answer to that question. The big picture national story, the personal story, as I'm qualified to answer you because of what you see in my life. Then the fear of the Lord, and then for your good always. Those are the answers, I think, to that question. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn to the young people and say, good job. We were hoping you would ask that question. We're glad you did. We're prepared to answer. We've been preparing for years in our personal life. And I'm going to tell you a story about the redeemed people of God into which this answer fits. And I'm going to tell you a personal story about how I was rescued from the slavery of sin in my life. And by the way, I think you should rehearse that story. Parents, dads, what's your story of coming to the truth? I've heard some of them. They're amazing. Kids need to hear that. I was personally, remember the first person, it was me. And you're now here today with me as your dad as part of that whole deliverance. That's kind of what I see in this answer there. But young folk, there are constraints on how you can ask this question. And so I think we would come back and say, look, let's put some boundaries around the way we're asking these questions. And so, starting in verse 10, so it should be when the Lord brings you into the land of which he swore you, Abraham says. Verse 12, and you're affluent and things are going well and you're living in houses you didn't even build and wells you didn't even dig. Verse 12, three things we're going to talk about. Then beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out. You'll fear the Lord. Same idea. 14, you shall not go after other gods. And 16, maybe most significant, you shall not tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him in Massah. So can you remember those things? Don't forget the Lord. Don't go after other gods. And don't test him. Tempt or test him. I'm going to talk about those three briefly here. Okay, first, forget Yahweh. who brought you out. And what he says there, and he says more about this in the next chapter 8, look, when things are going well, it's going to be real hard to remember your dependence on the Lord. Are we living in a time when things are going well? Affluence, peace, especially kids. They get anything they need. A lot of the things they want. Never get all you want, kids, especially, but anyway. Yeah, there's no sense of, and do they deserve all that? They worked hard for it, right, as kids? No. Did the Israelites deserve what they had? No. God gave it to them. Same thing. But that's the thing. In good times we say, verse 12, by my power, by my might, I deserve this. And then you start to forget what you believe. I think there's an important point to that, and I'm going to make it maybe a more subtle point. Sometimes kids come and they say, well, I just don't think it's fair that God doesn't allow, bad marriage to break up in divorce and let the people marry again, Okay, let's talk about that. What's the meaning of that law? We can work on that. But it isn't fair to forget and just decide, well, I don't believe in God anymore because of this question I have about that. Or I don't understand why this child is suffering from leukemia, having not done anything themselves wrong. And so, I don't understand that. So therefore, I don't believe in God anymore. You see, there's a little bit of a logical leap there that's a little bit out of context. Whatever led you to believe in God, that's still there. That evidence is still there. The evidence of design in the creation, right? The evidence of inspiration, the evidence of the resurrection of Christ, that didn't go away. Now, if you question that, that's a different question. But because something seems difficult in the moment, don't forget what led to your faith in the first place. You see what I'm saying there? So I say to these kids here, and I would be willing to say, in the constraint of our question, let's don't forget what we already have established as our faith. So sometimes when someone comes and has a really difficult question, I found the contradiction in the Bible, right? This says this says something else, okay? Well, did that affect all the other evidence that we have for inspiration? Maybe the thing to do is to step back and say, what do you actually believe about inspiration? And why do you believe that? Let's look at that evidence first, and don't forget what we already know. Does that make sense? So I think a part of our answer is to constrain the question to say, we're not, what does we say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here? Yeah, okay, this is a difficult question, but we're not going to throw our faith aside every time there's a hard question. Y'all help me make that point more clearly if I've not made it very clear. I think it's fair to question. It isn't fair to throw everything out just because I'm puzzled over one thing. And it is likely to happen in a crisis. And I'll tell you a specific crisis that often happens that I see, and that is you're in a tough moral spot. Here's an example. I remember as an elder, this happened. It had to happen a bunch of times before I would sink in that there's a pattern here, but still. Some guy would say, well, I'm just having doubts about my faith. And, you ask about it, it wasn't really very clear. And guess what's actually happening in his life? Wild guess.
You want to do something you know is against it.
No kidding, right. Like, I've kind of gotten to where I just cut to the chase and say, how's your marriage? You know what I mean? Because what's happening is he's wanting to do something, or he's already doing something he knows is wrong, and it conflicts his faith. And what's an easy way out of that? That dilemma that he has, he said, oh, well, I just have doubts about my faith. And I would just say, well, how's your marriage? Or something, whatever that issue is. And I'm telling you, that's a pattern I've seen. Maybe you have too. As you start seeing somebody backing away from their faithfulness and all that, you probably should go look at some of the crises in their lives, moral crises in particular. There's a hint that would happen there. So, in good times or in times of moral crisis, I think is a key time. And 2 Peter 3 says, this they willfully forget. So that's an interesting kind of forgetting. I don't want to remember, is what that means. And I think that's what Yahweh is telling Moses here. I think we've covered that. So that's in the next chapter. The second thing, restriction here, is don't follow after the gods of the people around you. Let me show you some passages in other parts of Deuteronomy that expand this a little bit more. Chapter 7, he says, don't make a covenant, don't make marriages, they'll turn away your sons after you. So let me go back and say, don't make covenants is kind of a way to protect yourself from this vulnerability because of the close ties that you have. right? We talked about why that was. They would destroy you. I think I put, the 2 Corinthians 5 or 6 is another New Testament of that. Here's another law. This one is fascinating to me. You know, they would enter Canaan. Let's just say they destroyed all the Canaanites like they were supposed to, which they didn't, but let's just say they did. And they come across a temple, a really interesting archaeological temple. I wonder if we should start studying in archaeological or sociological terms, how did these Canaanites worship? Wouldn't that be an interesting academic endeavor? I mean, we know it's wrong and all that, but, you know, wouldn't it be interesting just to know, I wonder what rituals they did in their worship, right? Were there women involved? You know, was it part of their, initiation of the young men? I'm asking Icky, you see where I'm going with this? Could you see a kind of a perverse fascination with that? Right? And that's if you just had a pile of stones left, but instead they had actually a society still practicing those things all around them. Are we sometimes curious about that? He says this, he said, take heed to yourself that you're not ensnared to follow them after they destroyed, and you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? Maybe I'll try that. I'll do likewise. There's some good stuff in that. You know that? You know there's some good stuff in all the world religions, right? So I kind of turned to the young people and I said, does God require of us to make an exhaustive comparative study of all the world religions, major and minor, to know for sure that that what we follow is true? Does he require that? Thankfully not. I mean, could you even do that? Is it even possible to know all enough about the major religions of the world and the major false teachings, to know all about those? No, there's a sense in which I've already demonstrated that there aren't any other gods. I did that in Egypt. I did that with the signs and wonders. We don't need to be exploring everything else in the whole world. You'll never get that done anyway, is kind of the point. I think that's what's being said here. And this is a scary one to me because I see it happening a good bit. And that is, if your brother, the son of your mother, your son or daughter, skip on down, secretly entices you, saying, let us go and serve other gods which you've not known, neither you nor the gods of your nor your fathers, of the gods of people which are around you, near to you or far off. 8, you shall not consent to him or listen to him. Does that ever happen, that a son and daughter actually is the source of difficulty for the parents? And the mess that they get themselves into causes the parents to start compromising what they actually believe and practice about certain things that they never would have questioned before, but because they don't want to lose the fellowship of the son or daughter or the wife of their bosom or a friend who is closer to your soul. Does that ever happen? I see it a lot more nowadays. The next generation, and they don't do right, and they become a bigger snare to the parents than almost anything else could be done. False teaching in the services or something, more than that. So, seduction by a close relationship is part of what he's saying. And that's a boundary, folks, to the question. Just to say, well, my folks did it, or my neighbors do it, or I have good friends and they're good people and they do it. That's not allowed. Okay, and then the third thing is, I think, important, and that is, don't test the Lord. That's in verse 16 of our text, chapter 6 of Deuteronomy. And what does that mean? Well, he actually defines it here by saying, as you did at Massa. You probably know that word actually means tested or tempted, and Meribah means contention. He uses both those words. You remember that story? We won't go look at it. It's in Exodus 17. I think we actually have a verse to show where they said, we're out of water. Why did you even bring us out here, Moses? You brought us out here to kill us, didn't you? And by the way, where is God anyway? They actually said that. So read this text here. This is testing God. This is from Exodus 17. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. So Moses said to them, why do you contend with me? That's the word. Why do you tempt? And probably a better translation, I think several of the translations use the word test the Lord. I think the idea of that is, I'm taking my idea of what God should have done and saying, well, he didn't do that. I'm not satisfied. It doesn't match my wisdom about what should be done. The people thirsted there for water. People complained against Moses and said, and by the way, guess what? Why is it? That's our construction. They're asking the Ma question, in this case, sinfully. Sinfully. Why is it sinful here? You brought us out here to kill us, our children, our livestock. Moses cried to the Lord, saying, what shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me. And then the incident where he got water from the rock, the first time, not the one where he hit the rock when he shouldn't have. Verse 7, he called the name of the place Massa and Meribah because of the contention of the children of Israel, because they tempted or tested the Lord, saying, what did they actually say in this question? It doesn't really suggest they used these words, but Moses said essentially, what did they ask? Is the Lord even here? Is he even among us or not? Sorry, young folk who are not here. You can't ask that question. You can't take your wisdom and say, I think it should be this way. If God doesn't meet that, I don't even think he's here. You see, that's a constraint on the question. So, forgetting the Lord, that's the first thing you're not allowed to do, right? Being seduced by others. And then the third thing is testing the Lord in some way. All right, we're almost done. Do we need another break? Keep going. I saw one no. Okay. Does this mean anything to you? Do you expect these questions to be asked? And I'm not sure that they're asked in some formal setting, like, I'm thinking of the bar mitzvah ceremony where maybe the 13-year-old is supposed to say a scripted out thing. No, I think it's just an everyday interaction thing. Let's see what we can do. I would say this: encourage those whom you mentor, those who look to you for answers, those whom you're trying to rear in the Lord. Encourage this dialogue. And I think it's a place for us to ask the questions too. When I see a command, I say, I don't understand that. What's the meaning of that command? I think I need to start asking these very same questions. How does it fit in a national story and so on? I think too, we need to know the national story of the Bible that's behind a bunch of things. For example, worship rituals, personal morality. Let me just show you an example here. Is there a Bible story behind these practices that we could tell? Remember, the national story was the context for explaining the blood on the doorpost and the redeeming of the firstborn and the Passover unleavened bread and all that. Are there stories behind some of these random? Y'all know that word? That word has become to be used in a different way by the generation as I see it. Y'all hear the word random a lot more than you used to, probably. I think technically random means there's no cause or purpose or meaning behind something. In mathematical terms, it means that every member of a set is equally probable to be selected, say. But it means there's no meaning behind it. That's what it means. That's what the word means. And so when the kids say random command, what are they kind of saying? What's that?
They disagree or they don't understand it.
There, yeah, exactly. And are they saying it doesn't make sense or it doesn't make sense to me?
To them.
And that worries me because it's a subjective view of the world which says if I can't make sense of it, it doesn't apply, right? That's worrisome to me. Of course, maybe I'm overly worried about things all the time anyway, but I've just noticed that use of the term. This random person walked up to me. We have these random practices in the church and that kind of thing. And I don't think they mean fully what I'm saying exactly, but it does grow out of the sense that there's a lot of meaningless, purposeless stuff in the world as measured by what I understand. But anyway. But is there any, behind these random acts of worship, right? Is there a story behind any of these? Is there a national story of God's plan behind baptism? Help me. Give me one. I put some references to help here if you want to look it up. Okay, good. That was a shadow. That's right. Yeah, in fact, it's used as a comparison. I think they're in 1 Corinthians 10, as we talked about. Does baptism is actually a reenactment of something, isn't it? The death and burial, resurrection of Jesus. There's a sense of washing, not putting away the filth of the flesh, and so on, right? Exactly. Right. So, yeah, there's more to the story. And sure enough, I can point to Acts 2:38 or even Romans 6:2 or 4, sorry, 6:4 as my proof text. But is it a richer answer if I can say, you see what's going on here in baptism? Here's what's actually happening in the act itself, and that's God's wisdom. There's a story behind this, just like there was a story behind the blood on the doorpost. How about the Lord's Supper? Is there some national story, Bible, scheme behind that? Yeah, in fact, it kind of dates back to the Passover that we studied that the Israelites would probably be asking about the same way. And what about prayer and singing? Hebrews 13 talks about it's a sacrifice of sorts. Right? A praise, sacrifice of praise. Is there a sense of sacrifice in that? Is there anything in the Bible story about why men and women's roles are different? And they all, which to the kids are weird. Like, women can't preach? Or why are you restricting them? I wouldn't have done it that way. My friends don't do it, and they're really good. And all those, okay. This story dates back to where was the first mention of the men and women? Yeah, like chapter 1 talks about male and female in the image of God. Chapter 2 is more specific about how all this came about. Jesus talks about that as part of the reason for the laws of marriage and divorce and so on. Yeah, there's a Bible national, y'all know what I mean by national story, as if we're Israelites and we know how we got here and all that. Yeah. And what about personal morality? Do you know why it's wrong to curse men? That's what James says, exactly that. One of our elders, whose name is James, he's black, and he says, yeah, Black Lives Matter, comma. Why? It's a good question. It's a mock question, I think, right? Why do they matter? I mean, in the social sense, why are we emphasizing their lives? Well, because they're made in the image of God, the very same reason. How about sexuality, the restrictions on sexuality? And marriage and divorce, laws about that, and permanence and all that. Is there a national story behind that? Jesus used that story when he explained what the real law of God was in Matthew 19, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. How about submission to authority? Is there an eternal story behind that? Yeah, they're put there by God, and it's part of his working out of his will in the world. Holiness, worldly yokes we mentioned before. Participation in nearly sinful things. That's really the context of 1 Corinthians 10. What's that section of 1 Corinthians about, by the way? Up to chapter 10. Maybe, 8 through 10? Y'all remember 1 Corinthians? There was a question they asked him. Eating of meats. Is that wrong? It's meat, right? Right? Oh, what if it came from an idol's temple? But an idol's nothing. You see, this is a question about, quote, is it sinful or not? That's what they want to know. We talked about that a little bit last year in the context of that. Well, okay, but there's a national story about, guess who? The Israelites that we just studied, and the temptations they had and the lack of faith they showed in the wilderness despite all the blessings God had given them. You see how Paul answers that question? What's the meaning of this law? And he says, well, there's a story you need to know. It was written for our admonition, learning, on whom the ends of the ages have come. And that's the context God gives it. Okay, so you get the idea. I think you should develop a personal story. I'm sorry. I think I should develop my personal story better than I know it. Why am I what I am today? How did I get here? How did I escape the problems that a lot of my peers fell into? How did that happen? Why do I have 4 faithful boys and grandchildren that I love a lot? Where did those blessings come from? Why am I not afraid of dying? This is my personal story. We should practice that. We should be aware that I was a slave in Egypt, and I was delivered, and because I was, you were too. And that's how you got to where you were. Do you remember that from the story that the Israelites were to tell their story? So develop a personal story. What did Yahweh, God, deliver me from? How has he blessed me? And how often do I tell that story? How is my love for God with all my heart, soul, and strength? Deuteronomy 6. Is it reflected in my life decisions? When I retire, for example. It's a time we just go on a bunch of cruises, right? Live out my materialistic ambitions. Or is it maybe to make decisions that are dedicated to God? How is it reflected in my life? And is it obvious that God's words are on my arm, in front of my eyes, on the doorposts and the gates? And y'all know what that meant in a kind of a symbolic way before. In my family, in my household, in my activities, even in my speech. That's kind of interesting. Do our Bible phrases there. And then, how careful am I to observe what I know based on the great story? Do I really search the Scriptures to know if this is the right thing to do or not? And that's what Moses told those. And what efforts do I make? How tolerant I am. A variation of carelessness. You know, something different pops up. I might actually react. Maybe it's knee-jerk. Maybe it's irrational. I might react negatively because I have a love for the truth and I just want time to think this through. And I really want to know in detail, why is this all right? It's for an innovation. And that's old people anyway, right? We like things not to change. But maybe there's a reason that I can keep studying and know the truth for that. So, this is the last chart. Thanks for listening through this whole thing this morning. How do I prepare for when my son asks? Prepare with personal faith and love, which gives the credibility that I need. We talked about that, personal story. And know the Bible story. What are the commands in the context? Tell my personal story. What have I experienced in deliverance and in blessings? And then, somewhere out there, it is probably right to say, He's God and you're not. And if you, get to that. That's important. That's in there. You remember in Moses' answer, it came after the other stuff, right? Near the end of the chapter. But yeah, there's judgment waiting for those that disobey God. That's part of the story. And also, it's for your good. He loves you. And there are blessings that will come from that. I think that's the answer Moses helped the Israelites to know to give when their son asks, Ma, law. I'm done. You have a prayer maybe? Or
Absolutely. Well, that's been a beneficial couple hours as far as I'm concerned. Thank Marty for being here with us. Wish him safe travel. Hopefully we'll see him again. That gives him a lot to think about. When I hear this kind of stuff, I just think about me, about my life, my kids, my situation. Sitting there thinking about a lot of things. Hopefully it'll help us all. Patrick, would you lead us in prayer before we go, please?
Our Father, we're thankful for your word. We're thankful for your love and sharing that with us. And we're thankful for men that encourage us in that. Father, help us to take things that we've learned, the things that we've been reminded of, the things that we've been encouraged in today. Let these things make us better servants of yours, better men, better fathers, as we fulfill our responsibility as those before us have done theirs. Help that encourage us. Help us to draw strength from each other. Bless us in our work. In Jesus we pray. Amen.
Thanks for being here, guys.